Okay, so today we're speaking about picky eating. So we're going to go through the discussion of picky eating, how to help your picky eater, making sure that your child is supported in this process. So myself, I am Teresa, and I am a BCBA for the company, and Rebecca is a BCABA. These are some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about when it's an issue, some of the medical things that we need to consider, some strategies, and then overall just planning for long term. So we'll discuss what a picky or selective eater is. So some of the common phrases that you'll hear are picky eaters, and picky eaters hard to describe or to kind of limit down. Typically, when I talk to parents about what a picky eater is, I say it is a child who limits themselves to usually like less than 10 foods, or they limit themselves to only specific foods in terms of carbs or specific textures. Some of the definitions that we think of for kids that are picky eaters, they have infrequent food refusal or frequent food refusal, meaning they're saying no often to new foods. They have limited repertoires of foods, meaning they only eat carbs and not vegetables or not many fruits, or they have excessive intakes of specific foods. So again, they're only eating fries and chicken nuggets. So when we look at that piece, then we're really looking at, okay, this kid is very selective, very picky, and we need to start to make some decisions and figure out how to support them. So when picky eating becomes a concern, we're looking at things like poor growth, failure to thrive. Is my child underweight or overweight? Does it impact their social functioning? So dinner time and mealtime is a social opportunity for your child. So do they get to socialize? Do they get to be a part of that family living routine? Their response to food sometimes will become extreme when they're picky eaters. So we'll see kids who gag or who throw up or even will throw items because they don't want that food on their plate. So looking at that piece, picky eating definitely is a concern if you're seeing any of these things. In the research and findings, when we look at picky eating in terms of our typical developing and kids with special needs, there is some differences, but in reality, it's very similar. So typical developing kids, about 25% of them have feeding problems. And feeding problems, again, could be not feeding themselves, not eating enough of a specific food, restricting themselves to only certain foods. And then about 80% of those kids that have special needs are having difficulty with feeding. Typically, when we see feeding problems arise is right around 18 months. This could be attributed to kids having that control and wanting to say no to things at that point, being able to communicate that they like things and that they don't like things. But when we compared what the issues were, whether it was typical developing or special needs, it's the same across the board. The issues are the same. So one of the issues that always comes up is parents are prepping foods that are only preferred, or we're seeing a lot of high carb diets. So kids who eat a lot of breads, fries, starches. We're seeing a lot of resistant behaviors. So no, I don't want it. Turning away. We see medical issues, so constipation. And then we're typically seeing, some of the specific differences are things like that children with autism tend to display a preference towards utensils or presentation of things. So then we want to look at, is there something wrong? When we look at if there's something wrong, we want to determine if there's something beyond behavioral, beyond them just being a selective eater, them just wanting control. So one of the things that we look at is gastrointestinal. So some kids have issues with bowel movements, diarrhea, constipation, allergies to food, and those things can cause them to not eat certain foods if their body has a reaction to it, or not digest certain foods the same way that we do. They may have swallowing issues. So if your child has swallowing issues, they may not be chewing food all the way. They may have food falling out of their mouth. You might see more drooling occurring. They may be a child who only takes bites and chews from the front of their mouth and not the back of their mouth. So all of these things are things that you want to consider when it comes to feeding, because your child may start to limit their foods because they can't chew those foods. They can't chew meats. The other piece is sensory. So kids who are showing aversions to certain textures, smells, the color, the way that the food looks, all of those things typically are going to be troubleshooted and worked on with your OT and your speech therapist. So those are more specialized therapies, and we typically like to defer to them to work on those things. Then the other piece is conditioned aversion. So if your child ate something bad once and it gave them a tummy ache or it made them sick to their stomach, they are likely to not eat that food again. They have anxiety when it's presented. They know it's not going to sit well with them. So some of the reasons why your child may have become a picky eater, we look at routines. Kids typically get set in routines. When we think about cultural and family considerations, if we're eating the same thing every day, or if we're presenting the same foods, even socioeconomic, finances wise, we have families who, are lower income, and it is difficult to pay for healthier food. The cheaper food is usually not the healthiest, so that's something to consider. As parents, we often have our own preferences, and we are picky eaters ourselves about certain things. So if we don't like broccoli, we may be less likely to provide that option to our child, because we assume, well, they're probably not going to like it either. But they definitely have their own taste buds. They have their own opinions. We have to look at, are we providing enough choices? So sometimes families don't want to provide all those choices because they know that the child's not going to try it, and they don't want to waste food. So that's definitely goes into the fact of, the cost of food and the fear of us having to waste the food. So if we stop providing those choices, kids get used to that routine, and then we get really stuck. We're not really providing the opportunity for them to explore and venture out. Reinforcement. So when we think about reinforcement, typically parents often reinforce a kid's behavior when it comes to eating. So a child can be allowed to escape the table and receive, all of their favorite things. If, they're not eating their food, we just say, well, forget it. You can leave the table. It's fine. You're not going to eat. So they get removal of that non-preferred. They're also reinforced because sometimes we provide them with the desired items. So if he's not eating the rice that we prepared, we say, okay, well, you know what, just give him the French fries because that's what he always eats. So he's reinforced by that. And then the other piece is that they're reinforced by attention. So they get all this verbal praise and attention from parents. And during that verbal praise and attention from parents, what we're basically saying to them is, you get all this attention for not eating your food and for not trying your food. So then the behavior occurs more often. So now we have these behaviors that are happening within mealtime. And then mealtime is just overall a struggle. When we think about the sensory processing piece, that's something that you want to consider with your child's mealtime habits and behaviors. So when we think about sensory, you want to think about all your 5 senses. So auditory, if the food sounds mushy or crunchy, it might not be appealing to your child. If the flavor is really strong or really salty or just really bland, your child may be a child who likes things very plain and not as flavorful, or vice versa. They may be a child who thinks that sour foods are really good or really spicy foods are very good. So when you're looking at venturing into new foods, you want to stick to what they like and kind of introduce new foods in that arena. Presentation and color matters to them. So the chicken nugget is a chicken nugget, but it looks very different from one place to the next. And you and I both know that they taste different. So if that presentation isn't the same, even though it may have been the same food, sometimes that will make kids think the food is different and they won't try it. We look at textures. So is the child, when they're touching food, especially at the age of 2, everything is done by hand and they finger feed. If they're finger feeding and they've touched that food and it feels gross to them and they don't like that texture, then they're less likely to put it in their mouth. So looking at that piece, is the texture something that's bothering them? And we can look at varying and adjusting that texture to get them to try that food. And then the last piece is the smell and odor. So sometimes foods that taste really good don't always smell great, and people have to work past the smell to actually try it. But if we don't work past that smell, we're kind of stuck. We don't really have anywhere to go. So looking at that piece is going to be important. Other things to consider is where we're eating. So some kids have gotten used to sitting in a high chair or a seat. When we're in a high chair, there's no opportunity for your kid to leave. So they're kind of forced to stay there. But some kids that are at a table, they haven't figured out mealtime rules, that they need to stay at the table, they need to eat. So look at that piece. Has your kitchen been negatively paired? So if you have regularly practiced shoving food in your kid's mouth, giving them food that they don't like in the kitchen, having all these tantrums in the kitchen, then he's likely going to not want to be in the kitchen. And anything that we do in the kitchen, he's going to not want to do. So we've negatively paired that environment. The other piece is if your child trusts you. For parents who've tried to sneak food in or who've tried to just have their kid try it because they know if the kid tries it, they'll like it, but you kind of break that trust. And when your child doesn't trust you, it makes it harder to implement all these strategies. So making sure that you and your child have trust when it comes to mealtime, that they know you're not going to trick them. Family dining versus solo eating. Because of COVID and even sometimes just family living, work schedules, we often find that families are not eating at a table together. And eating at a table is important because it creates that social interaction. It allows for modeling. It allows for you to, reinforce some of those behaviors of eating. But if your child is eating by themselves, there's no social interaction. There's no modeling of other behavior. And there's no way that you can say, hey, good job, you took a bite of that. So family dining is important. And then even looking at aversion to certain utensils. Some kids don't like metal utensils when they first start eating because they're likely to clank their teeth a lot. So trying a plastic utensil or trying a bigger spoon or a heavier spoon may be more beneficial. So all of these things you want to consider when you're looking at what are some of the issues that your child may be having in terms of feeding. Rebecca is going to start to talk to you about some of the antecedent strategies. So some of the strategies that you can utilize while you're working with your child after you've determined what some of the issues are.
All right. So antecedent strategies are what we put into like the environment to set up to make this a successful situation for the child, this routine. So already it's aversive, right? They don't like it. So we put some of these things in, and what you choose is really what you feel comfortable doing. So if you feel like some of these strategies work, but not all of them, that's totally fine. If you want to choose what makes sense for your family and how easy or how feasible it is to implement. So before we choose a strategy, we want to think about some things that we want to consider are these items on the slide. So aggressive behaviors. If your child has aggressive behaviors, has a hard time, like not being in control, we are more than likely need to start slow. We got to take those baby steps to build that trust, to build this routine with them, because we don't want to run into a lot of those behaviors, because then the child negatively pairs mealtime. So we may need to start slow, even just playing with the food, just introducing it, but not necessarily having them, touch it or put it towards their mouth. Preference list, knowing what exactly your child does like. It's great because then we can use that to reinforce the kiddo. What type of other reinforces the child likes is also important, so we can reward those behaviors that we do see. If they took a bite, or if they smelled the food, or if they licked it, we want to reinforce those attempts to trying new foods. Like Tressa mentioned, the utensils, some kids do have a hard time, especially when they've learned like mom or dad shove the food in. At some point, that fork or utensil becomes very negatively paired with food. So we might just have to build the trust with just the utensils and try different types, or even just working on like, we're just going to work on having him hold the spoon or bringing it to his mouth without any food. Sitting's a big factor of eating, right? We need to sit and be able to focus on what we're doing. This might be a battle in itself that we may have to target first, getting the child to learn to sit for several minutes versus, wanting to walk around with food in their mouth. So this is probably something we have to consider. And then feeders, who's involved? So this is a big part. If we're implementing these changes for this routine and implementing these strategies, it needs to be consistent for the child. So everyone who does dinner or does lunch or feeds the child needs to know what these strategies are and be able to implement them so it's consistent and the child learns this is the new routine for eating. In the next slide, so here's some just fun ways that we can incorporate more foods or ways to make it a little bit more engaging for them. So making it fun, right? That's a big part for a lot of kids. They like silly things. They respond more when it doesn't feel like it's work. So being silly is great. Making silly noises like yummy or ooh, I'm gonna eat it. Using characters is a great way. Sometimes it's even good to just take the child to the store and let them pick out their utensils and their plate, because they get some of that control part of things, and they they get to choose which character they want to eat off of. So that's always an exciting way of getting them motivated. Presenting food in different manners. chicken nuggets are not like dino nuggets, right? So we can also do that. We can do that with a variety of food. I know some parents cut their fruits or their veggies into different shapes so that the child can label some of those things, because guess what? That child loves shapes and letters. So that makes it a little bit more enticing for the child to eat. And then singing songs. There's so many songs on YouTube that we can use, or we can create songs, we can turn take. It just becomes a very interactive and more of a play-based routine versus like I need to sit here and we need to eat because mom said so. In the next slide, we have scheduled meals. So the big part about the routine, like we mentioned, is that it's important to have routine, but not to be too routine that the child can't adapt to different environments. But we still ultimately want to create a schedule for the child, because the schedule really helps the child learn those hunger cues. If our child grazes all day, meaning we're leaving food out, they have options all day long to snack, it doesn't let the child start picking up on those hunger cues. And if we initiate, like if we're telling them you need to eat, again, like it's where we're not creating we're not letting them know what that sensation is, and knowing, okay, when my stomach does this sound or this pain, I need to eat. So routines also help the child start learning those hunger cues, and it lets them also know when food is available. Because if you have food out all day, it's not necessarily motivating, because they know, oh, I'm going to get food regardless, right? But if you create a schedule and you say, okay, we eat at 9 and we only have 30 minutes, right? You can put a timer. And if those 30 minutes the child doesn't eat, then we remove the food. And at that point, they learn, I'm not going to eat until snack time. So I should eat in breakfast time, because then I'm not going to have food for a couple of hours. It just maintains that consistency with that child, and it motivates them to eat when food is actually presented. Family meals are super important. I think right now it's really hard because we're in this pandemic, and we all eat in front of the TV, or child eats in front of the TV and we eat at the dinner table. It's important to do the family meal so the child can see that we're all eating the same food. You can still put in some of the food they like, but you ultimately still want to provide them what's on your plate. Because like Teresa said, like we don't want short order cooks, right? We want to make sure everyone, like the child knows, like what mom eats is what I eat, and like we're not trying to make different meals for them. Okay, in the next slide. So modeling is also a great strategy. It's very simple. It's really doesn't take a lot of effort. You do it naturally through your day for your child. But it is a great way if your child is imitating. They like to imitate actions that adults do, or they like, to imitate siblings. So we can do a peer model or an adult model. So if your child has an older sibling or younger sibling, having them model trying new foods, or using their utensil to eat, and we provide reinforcement to the child that gives you the child that we're working with the like more of that motivation to try that bite of food that their sibling ate, because guess what, mom gave reinforcement to the sibling. So that's a really great way. Even adult models, like if you guys reinforce yourselves, like let's say you're eating with dad and you reinforce dad's eating, right? Good job, dad. You took a bite of that broccoli. You're giving attention to somebody else besides the child, and that motivates them to try that. Using enthusiastic modeling is important. I know sometimes veggies are not the best thing, and we just want to make sure a kid likes them and tolerates them, so we make it more enthusiastic. Like, this is yummy. You're gonna get so strong. Your eyes are really good. They're gonna be better because you're eating your carrots. It's just really important to use those positive things so they know, like, okay, mom really responds to this. Mom likes it, so let me try it. Modeling tasting and response. So let's say your child doesn't like something, and normally they throw it or they spit it out and then they get mad. You still want to teach them an appropriate way to end that food. If they don't want it, instead of throwing it, they can say no, right? Or shake their head, give it back to you, put it in a cup, push it away, versus throwing it and going into those negative behaviors. So you can still model, oh, I don't like this, I'm not going to eat it. And that way they learn, this is how I say no to those foods. Okay, and the next slide we have stimulus fading. Um, Stimulus fading is basically changing the way something looks over time. It's very slow process, but it's not like we're tricking the kid. The kid still gets that desired item. And over time, we just modify what it looks like so that they're accustomed to it either being more or less of. So the first one, like for example, dilating juice. Some kids really love apple juice, and that's the only thing they'll drink. But if you give them water, they don't want water. So what do? We pair with water, right? We slowly add in more water little by little through the weeks, and we dilute the juice so eventually the child learns to tolerate the taste of water on its own. And we no longer have that issue of the child who doesn't want water and only wants juice. Some kids are very particular about their cups or the specific bottles. Um, so we say, okay, well, let's start here. Let's work on, let's say my child doesn't like, only has like a blue cup with the straw and doesn't like the sippy cups, right? So we use the same cup, but maybe we take the top off, or maybe we buy that cup in a different color, and so then it slowly starts to modify and change a little bit. It's still the same cup, the cup, and it gives me my liquid, but it's slowly altering it so that the child adapts. Taking smaller bites. So smaller bites is great. So when a child is learning some of those new foods or tasting them, you can start with small bites and slowly increase the amount of food that they're learning to tolerate. Oftentimes we want them to eat all of the meal, but if it's something new, let's say we're doing broccoli and the child doesn't like broccoli, I'm going to be excited if they take a little bite and say, oh, you did it. We're going to reinforce that for a little bit. And the next time we say, let's do 2 bites and then mommy gives you this. And that way they're learning to increase that. Liquids to solids. Some kids have trouble with thick or chewy or, not creamy foods, and they often resort to those pureed foods. We can slowly add in more chunks. So normally what we recommend is start with your creamy and then just leave some chunks in there, just a little bit. It's still the same food, right? Maybe we didn't blend it all the way, and slowly increase the thickness of it so that they learn not everything's going to be purely pureed. There is going to be some different textures in there or consistencies. Foods are similar in color. So if your kid loves like certain, loves all color green stuff, then let's work on green colored veggies and fruits so that they learn there's different ways that we can eat food or different types of foods that come in this color. And the last one, cup to spoon. So if your child doesn't like spoons, it's a hard thing. You can start with something bigger. So like your measuring cups, they're considered still like a little measuring spoon, right? But they're bigger and they look different. Start there and slowly decrease to the smaller typical utensil. Okay, so the next one, so pairing and presentation. So this is also a great strategy. There's 2 ways that you can do this. You can do either on the same plate or on the same spoon. If you use a separate plate, you would put a really high preferred on one plate. So let's say your child loves rice, and you put a lot of it in there, like a normal amount of that they normally eat, because it's familiar in their diet, right? They love this, they enjoy it. And then we put on the second plate something they don't really like, or maybe they have never tried. And it's a little bit, just a small portion of it, because when you pair it, like, okay, mom gave me a lot of what I want and only a little bit, they're more inclined to eat it because they still get what they want. They're just pairing it, making it a positive thing for them. Or you could do it with a spoon. So you can put like more rice on the top part of the spoon, and then a little bit of maybe of the broccoli at the end of the spoon, but they still see that rice, right? The biggest thing with if you're using the spoons and the plates, you don't want to mix the foods. You want them to be separated still, so they can clearly see that you're giving them broccoli. Because then if you try to mix it, kids are smart, right? They start pulling out like the pieces of the actual item or actual food they don't like. And then we lose that trust. Like they're like, mom's gonna mix things or she's gonna trick me into it, and then they're gonna resist that rice in general. Sometimes it does happen. So that's a con of this one is more so that if your child is very picky or they're very strong-willed in the sense of, oh, mom always pairs broccoli with rice, they might not like the rice anymore because we've negatively paired it. But you still want to try it. So you could try it with different with different foods that may be new, so they don't always feel like it's broccoli all the time. But the more consistency we do it, the easier it'll be, and then they'll learn to tolerate it. Okay, so the next one is behavior momentum. This is relatively easy to also implement because it doesn't necessarily have to be foods. It could be different direction. So for a kiddo who doesn't like a lot of, or doesn't like, needs a lot of reinforcement and has a hard time following through, we can use this. So what we do is give them easy directions that we already know they do and they love to do. So let's say we're doing, we compare this with food. So in this example, the kid loves French fries, right? But maybe he's never tried carrots, or he doesn't really care for them, right? And so he always resists it. What we're gonna do instead, we're gonna give them a bite of their favorite food, and each time they eat it, we're reinforcing them. We're saying, "You're doing so great. I love that you ate your fries. Awesome. High five for those 3 bites, those 3 first bites." And then that 4th one, we're going to deliver the carrot and say, "Okay, try this one now." And that way, because they've gotten a lot of reinforcement those first 3 times, and they've been successful and they've gotten what they like, they are more inclined to try that. The food they don't like. So it builds momentum, builds motivation. It helps build compliance, and it doesn't have to be just necessarily food-based. So you can add in different directions. So some kids are really great at action or body parts, right? So you could say, touch your nose, touch your head, show me clapping, and then you give them that last piece of food that's new for them. It just really helps to reduce the behaviors that occur when we just automatically deliver the negative food for them. Okay, the next one we have is control and choice. We still want to provide kids the choice, because choice is a big factor for our 2-year-olds that we work with, right? They're very autonomous. They want to be in control of their whole environment, and they want to rule the world. So we want to give them that sense of control still. It's okay. Like, it's not a bad thing that they want to be in control, but we just want to make sure we are able to share that control. So some ways that they can get control is to provide them with choices. So choices of foods, right? Maybe you have cucumbers and peas, and you can say, what do you want to eat today, right? You're still ultimately in control, because you've given them these 2 choices, and that's it. Different plates. Like, which one do you want to work? Which one do you want to eat? Or do you want to use a spoon? Do you want to use a fork? All of that is their choice, right? And maintains that motivation because they're part of this routine now. Where do we sit? Do you want to sit on the table, on the floor today? Do you want to go outside and have a picnic? Those are all great ways to reinforce it, because we're changing the environment. They feel confident and in making those choices. And then even the reinforcers, like, what do you want to do after we finish eating? Right? You've already paired it, like, okay, we need to eat, and then we get to make that choice of what we want. So then they're excited to finish eating, so they can go play with their reinforcing. You can also provide a forced choice. So let's say if a child wants to eat and wants like a dessert versus an actual food, you would just say no to that junk food and just say, look, these are your choices, and that's it. And if they don't want it, then ultimately they're not hungry. Then we have PREMAC. So PREMAC principle is your first this and that. It's really simple. The first this is always your low preferred food. And then that part is your reinforcement. It really works really well because the kid can see like what's right after, and it's continuing on what the child is, what the direction is for the child to complete. So the child is provided a preferred item activity, and then after they are able to be reinforced. So first you eat 2 bites of your broccoli, and then you can get down. Or first you gotta eat your food, and then you can have tablet time. The biggest part is to make sure that it's very simple in terms of like your language is very simple. It's not a long direction. It's just first this, then that. You want to keep using the first this, then that phrase so they know what that means. And you don't want to use it as a form of bribery. So when we think about bribery is that we give that reinforcer first. We say, okay, mom's going to give you a cookie, but you're going to have to eat your rice after. It doesn't work like that, because then the child loses motivation to eat that rice because he's gotten what he wanted. And so then we've lost them, and it's not something that they're going to work for. And just be mindful of the requirements. So if your child doesn't eat all of their meal right away, or normally doesn't eat their whole meal, we can't make them do that. We're taking baby steps, right? So it becomes this new routine, and they're learning to tolerate it. So maybe we say, you take 3 bites and then you get down. And eventually we'll build up to, you have to eat the whole meal. Okay, so the last part of your antecedent strategies are sensory and exposure. This is a big part. If your child is very picky or doesn't like certain textures or consistencies of food, your sensory and exposure part will be important, because the more we expose them, the more they learn to tolerate looking at it, tolerate smelling it, tolerate, it being in the environment. It will make it more likely that they're going to bring it closer to their mouth. When you think about some of the foods that we eat, right, they're not always appealing. They don't smell great sometimes, and we learn to adapt to it, because then we taste it and we're like, okay, it tastes good, but we have to adapt to it. I don't want to eat something that doesn't smell great in the beginning. It just takes some time, and over time we learn to tolerate, and our taste buds learn to adapt to it, so it doesn't become this aversive food. So the ways that we can do sensory and exposure is just to play with food. Food is it's such a fun way for kids to use all of their senses, and pair it with some of the activities that they like in general. You see this picture of this tie-dye spaghetti and this Jello dig where there's toys in there. So it makes it a little bit more fun. The child, when they do want to bring it up to their mouth, we want to reinforce it, and so that way they're more likely to do it in the future. So we want to expose kids to different varieties of textures. If they don't like anything, then we definitely want to start with some of this play-based sensory things. Okay. And then now we're going to talk about consequence strategies. So consequence strategies are what we put in after the behavior has been displayed, to either reinforce it or to reduce it. So the first one is reinforcement. So like we said, reinforcement is a big factor for kids. If we don't reinforce, then it's not a behavior that will last for a long time. If it's a reinforced behavior, it will maintain over time. So we want to make sure we use reinforcements for all of the good behaviors that your child displays throughout their day, and also through their food. It helps build the motivation, because if you give them something after they try this food, the next day they're going to try that food again, because they remembered, oh, I got something right after it. There's different types of reinforcement procedures and some different types of reinforcers. So in this slide, we can see we have like edibles, activities, tangibles, social praise, and then sensory. The reinforcement is dependent on your child. So what may work for one kid may not work for another kid. If your kid really likes to be active, he might be reinforced by doing outside play after eating. But maybe your kid loves cars or letters or puzzles or shapes, then maybe an activity like that will be more reinforcing after. So it just depends on your children, and you guys know your children best. So choosing a reinforcer that you know that the kid will like is going to be important, so that they're willing to try that food. Let's see. Okay, and then we have token economy. So we talked about we talked about reinforcement. So this is a great way to over time reduce reinforcement. So when, let's say your kid's starting to eat or take bites and they expect either candy or they expect to be taken outside every time, that's not always the case. In the beginning, yes, because we just want to motivate them. But at some point, once they learn it and they're doing it without you having to prompt them or, forcing them to try to eat a bite or anything like that, you want to reduce the reinforcement by using like a token economy. So this still provides reinforcement, but they have to do more to earn that reinforcer. It's almost like a sticker chart. So it's a visual laminated board that if you guys would want to try this, we can provide it. You can let your teacher know or the supervisor on the case know, and they're able to send it out. And again, it's very individualized to the child, so we can put different characters on there that they like, and also the tokens can be specific thing, or the rewards are specific to that child. So if your child likes candies, or they like going outside, or Play-Doh, or music, things like that, we can make those pictures, and then they know, okay, I'm working for this specific activity. And you say, okay, you have to do four bites, or you have to eat all 3 meals, and then you get that reward. So the child gets to choose the reinforcer, which is great. So they have a variety of whichever ones they want to choose from, which makes it more motivating for them because they get that control. And then the number of tokens required depends on your learner. So when you first introduce this, maybe you just increase it to 2 to 3 tokens. And then after that, you slowly add in more. So eventually do 10, right? And then they get that reward. This next consequence strategy is a mixture. So you have both token economy and behavior momentum paired together. And this is like a great little play because it's like a little activity. So it's a maze, and you can see where you have your start and your finish. You put your foods in here. So you put some similar foods in here, and maybe 1 or 2 foods they don't really care for, or they're new, to continue that momentum. So these first 3, maybe we do something they like. Maybe they like cheese. We put 3 little cheeses on the first 3, and then maybe we put in like a piece of tomato in that 4th one, and then 3 more cheeses, and then a piece of tomato. And then at the end, they get a really big reinforcer. The high reinforcers at the end, but they only get that high reinforcer if they finish this little maze. So it's a great visual. It's a great way to continue their motivation and explore new foods. But you also pair it with reinforcement. You're saying, good job, you're doing so great. Oh, I like that you took that bite. And eventually you can increase it, right? You can increase the amount of tomatoes you put in, or decrease the amount of cheese you're adding in, so that it's more of the food that you're trying to target. Okay, so this one is planned ignoring. So some kids have attention-seeking behaviors during mealtime, and they're silly about it. Maybe they drop food, or maybe that they know they don't want to eat this, so they do the attention-seeking behavior. When they are doing attention-seeking behavior, like when they maybe spill their milk and then look at you and then laugh, you want to make sure that you don't react, because that's the biggest part. When we react, we reinforce the behavior over time. So we want to implement planned ignoring. Planned ignoring is really what it sounds like. You just don't give attention. You don't give any eye contact. You don't respond to the whining. You don't say no, don't do that, stop throwing. You could just block and remove the items. If your child has some self-interest behaviors or dangerous, we just want to block and redirect. Let's say your kid likes to rock back and forth on his high chair because he knows like that gets some reaction from a parent because they think he's gonna fall. We're just gonna stop that. We're gonna hold down the poles of the high chair and not let that be a choice, and teach them how to gain attention appropriately. Calling your name, tapping you, right? We want to provide attention and praise for the behaviors we want to see. So when they are calm and, they say ma, or they're starting to eat, or they hand you that item, you want to reinforce those things versus the negative behaviors. And then attention provided during mealtime, if we reinforce it, it's going to occur over time again. So they think it's funny, they love the response. So the way we respond to even like some accidents, they might try to do it again in the future. But by then, like, okay, this is not what I want, so I'm just not going to provide any attention for it again. The next one we have is escape extinction. So escape extinction is what we implement to reduce those escape behaviors. So let's say a kid throws food because he doesn't want to eat it, or he begins to bang his or rock his body front and back on his high chair, or tries to leave the area right from the seat. We want to block this and teach them in either an appropriate way, or teach them to tolerate that we're not escaping mealtime. So we're not providing or allowing a child to escape if the escape behavior happens during mealtime. It's challenging to do with severe behavior. So that's why we recommend starting from the antecedent side of things, making sure that we put in some of those other strategies so that we reduce these behaviors occurring. When we think about high chairs or those booster seats that have those little seat belts, we recommend not using those as an escape behavior, because ultimately the child's just pairing that as a way like, I can't get out. We want them to learn how to sit comfortably without feeling like they're constricted, right? We want them to learn how to escape appropriately. You could require one more bite. Okay, you have to take one more bite, and then you're all done, right? Or begin feeding with letting them know what's expected. You have to finish 2 of these items, or you have to take 4 bites, and then mommy will take you down, or then you can go watch TV. Letting them know what's expected during mealtime is really important so that we're setting them up for success. Not allowing the child to throw the food. Some kids are throwers. They love to throw food when they don't want it, right? Because, or they're mad that we didn't give them what they wanted the first time and now they have to eat just veggies. When a child doesn't want something, we want to teach them again how to say no, or how to communicate they don't want it. So we can have a little cup where they can put the food they don't want in there. The great thing is that you're still presenting it, so they're learning to tolerate it in their environment, but also learning to pick it up and put it in the cup that they don't want. And right there's your sensory piece. Consider using the timers to end or to signal the end of mealtime. Timers are really easy to implement, and they work really well for kids once they learn what it is. Once they learn that tune of that timer, it can signal the end of mealtime. So this means that at some point that the child learns, okay, once the timer goes off, that means I can get off, or that means my meal is done. But on the opposite of that, your kid may be very smart and know, like, I'm just gonna sit here, and once the timer goes off, I get to leave, and guess what? They didn't eat. So if you have a kiddo like that, you just want to make sure we're not providing any other meals after that until it's time to eat. Like if he wants to eat, we'll give the same meal that we offered, and it's not, or provide a healthier choice so that they don't always feel like, if I get out of this, I'm going to get something later that I like. So making sure we keep maintaining that routine and consistency for them. Okay, so Tress is going to end us off with planning and generalization.
So with planning and generalization, long term, we want you to be able to create a better eater, to create a child who understands how to have appropriate mealtime behaviors, understands how to respond when non-food items are presented. So we encourage parents to practice it with a variety of people. So parents, grandparents, siblings, to generalize feeding. So whether we're looking at using different items, different foods, different utensils, even different seating arrangements. For some of our families, if we change the color of the food or the utensil that's being used, your kids will kind of shut down and go back into some of those old behaviors. We want to make sure we're getting them to explore. Then we even look at settings. So when we practice feeding, we typically practice it within the home, but are those behaviors being transferred out into the community, or if they're in school or at a daycare setting? So making sure that all of these behaviors long-term are generalized and maintained by practicing it with all different types of stimuli, people, and settings. For planning, when you're planning to get ready to work on the feeding strategies, so you've looked at some of the issues your child might have, you've thought about some of those strategies and said, okay, this one is definitely something that I think would benefit him or that he could learn from, or this might be a good starting point. We always recommend, again, that you rule out the medical issues first, that there's nothing medically going wrong and not an issue in terms of him eating. Then you want to look at, if you're working with a team of specialists, whether it be speech, OT, or us, we typically like to collaborate together. So if speech is working on his muscles and his mouth, and OT is working on how he holds the spoon, and then we are working on the behaviors related to sitting at a table, all of that can help long term. So making sure that we all communicate and we're all working towards the same goal. We may be working on different things, but we want to not work against each other. We want to make sure we're making decisions based on the child's need. What is their need? Is it that we need them to eat more foods? Is it we need them to eat a variety of foods? taking that into consideration, also their affect. You have some kids who just really struggle, and emotional regulation is challenging. So we don't want to push them to that point where they shut down, they tantrum, and they don't eat at all. And then what you feel confident doing as a parent, because some of these strategies are best implemented by a specialist, but you want to feel confident in implementing them when we're not around. So making sure that a strategy that your team is implementing, that you feel confident doing it, because ultimately you're going to be practicing these mealtime strategies. And you always want to do the antecedent strategies first, because again, we don't want to run into behaviors. We don't want to have a difficult child during mealtime. And then if we have those behaviors, then you do the consequence strategies. And then if you don't know where to start, typically we recommend that parents take a look at what kids are eating on the daily. So take a food diary or food journal for the day and see where they're getting in all of their calories, basically, because some kids will get in all of their calories from the liquid intakes, from the Pediasures and the Pedialytes, and that will ultimately fill your child up to the point that they don't necessarily need to eat. So looking at that piece is going to be big, because then you can determine, do I need to reduce liquid intake? Also looking at if your child is grazing throughout the day and eating small snacks, it is giving them that satiated feeling so that when meals are presented, mealtime isn't really something that they're motivated for. They're not hungry because we didn't allow for them to be hungry. So looking at that piece will be important, and making sure that you plan for when you decide to start will be good. We have some resources listed, and then we have some time for questions. If you do have questions regarding the training or the strategies, if you would like more support or you would like us to attend a session to kind of help come up with a plan, you just let your teacher know and they'll contact us, or you can contact us directly. And then if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat or you can unmute your mic. We have a little bit of time left over. And if not, thank you so much for joining us.